people are into this now.
Yeah, I believe it. I believe it.
And that's how we've been driving some new users to our platform, is just putting the information out. So we do this show on Fridays, but on Tuesdays I do a show about lumber futures,
Oh,
and then my partner does shows just about the lumber market for Wednesdays and Thursdays with two other
oh, very,
guests.
very cool.
Do you remember there was a company in Chicago called Tasty Trade? I don't know if you ever
Mm-hmm.
heard of them.
Mm-mm.
And they basically built themselves a network, much like CNBC, except quite a bit smaller and only streaming online. And they just sit there and talk about trading all day long.
Really, really, that's funny.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. All right, how's the family doing?
Doing great. Awesome. Absolutely awesome. So Ian is up in France in a heat wave right now, doing this 5-day training for climbing stuff.
Okay.
Belinda's in London she's in an internship this year for a pharmaceutical company. And we made her go out and get a fan yesterday because it's going to be like 100 degrees in London on Monday and Tuesday. So a lot of weather stuff going on with the kids.
That's unheard of, right?
That would be their all-time hottest temperature ever recorded.
So the question is, are these all time ever recorded because of some sort of change going on in our world that
Mm-hmm.
that we are part of?
The question that comes up now and then. Yeah, it's interesting.
I can only imagine you get asked that question. Um, all right, so we'll give it a minute or two. Oh, you know what I want to do is get out my phone and see the people coming in. So some people watch this live, and then a bunch of people come back and watch it afterwards on YouTube.
Yep. Yep. Oh, afterwards, can you, if you can send me the link to that, probably push that to our marketing team. It's good for
For
your
sure.
thing too. So
Yeah, absolutely. Jory will be all over that.
cool.
Um, did Ian figure out a school that he's interested in yet?
Yeah, he's going to the University of Birmingham in September.
In England, Birmingham,
Yeah.
not Birmingham, Alabama.
No, not a Crimson Tide. No. And then Belinda is at University of Leeds. No, it's the next year. She's been a year at this pharmaceutical lab in London, her third year. A lot of times over here, they do third year in industry. So she's been working at the pharmaceutical lab, from last September, and she has another 6-7 weeks. But she'll be going back and then finish her degree this next year, back in University of Leeds. So he'll be in Birmingham and she'll be in Leeds, which for us is awesome because we can go there for Thanksgiving and, visit both kids real easy and stuff like that. Because he had numerous schools at California. He Michigan was on his list.
I
Toronto.
remember that.
He had numerous schools out there, but yeah, he would picked England. We kind of told him many months ago that California is not going to work out. It's just too far away from here, So, but yeah, he's going to be in England too, which is awesome.
Excellent. All right,
Much
so
easier for us.
let's kick this off, everyone. Welcome. It's Friday, July 15th. Can't believe it's already July 15th. It is the Smart Market call, and today we have with us Jon Davis. Jon Davis is the chief meteorologist for Everstream Analytics. And as a side note, Jon Davis is a good friend of myself and Jory's. We met through our kids were climbing together. But it turned out that Jon and I share an alma mater. We both went to the University of Wisconsin, which most people don't realize has one of the top meteorologic. Am I saying that right?
Atmospheric science.
Okay, one of the top atmospheric science schools in the world.
Yep.
And that is where Jon went to school. What I find fascinating is, when you think of a meteorologist, you think of the person you watch at the nightly news. Jon never went that direction. You immediately went out to Wall Street. So, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so after going to school in Madison, Wisconsin, literally in 2 days, I went to New York and started working on Wall Street. And that was in the commodity division. And I spent 18 years at Citigroup. So some in New York, and then came back to Chicago, which was my hometown, and the rest of my time there. So it was really 18 years at Citigroup. And the final portion of that, then I was chief meteorologist for Citigroup, and it was all what we call applied meteorology, taking weather data and weather information and applying that to figure out things and look at risks. Agriculture was a huge part of that. Energy was a huge part of that. And so the first nearly 20 years of my career was in the Wall Street world, looking at applied meteorology, mainly in commodities, but other things as well that began to get involved in. And then after 18 years at Citigroup, then the whole team was recruited to an energy company called Chesapeake Energy, based in Oklahoma City. They opened an office for us in Chicago, so we stayed in Chicago. And then that was looking at risk management from an energy perspective. And we kept the agricultural information kind of going. And Chesapeake at that time had this rapid growth phase, from '03 to 13, and became one of the biggest energy firms in the world here at that time, and kind of changed the world of natural gas and changed the world of energy here during that 10 or 11 years. So an amazing period during that time frame. When we joined Chesapeake Energy, there were 400 employees, and within 4 years, there was 14,000. Just incredible growth, and became one of the biggest energy firms, out there. And then from that point on, then the last, well, eight years has been Everstream Analytics. And instead of looking just at agricultural risk management and energy risk management, we look at the entire supply chain end to end. And what we are trying to do is solve and conquer supply chain complexity and disruption, and through data, through software. And it starts with energy and agriculture and goes through the entire process here coming up. So my pathway from Madison, Wisconsin to now has been, very straightforward. Agriculture, energy, supply chain logistics, it kind of just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and looking at applied meteorology and how it relates to, the world.
So uh, here's kind of not a loaded question, an unanswerable question. You must have made these companies a ton of money.
Uh-huh.
Like when you really think about, if you can be ahead of the curve as far as understanding what's going to happen from a weather standpoint,
Mhm.
you can either save yourself a bunch of money or put the right position on to make a bunch of money.
Mhm. Well, think of, the amount of weather exposure out there for different industries. It's massive, and it's always kind of been that way. And then, I think what's happening in the private sector, it started 20, 25 years ago, and now it's really wrapping up, as I think the private sector then realizes the amount of risk, and realizes trying to capture that, risk, and begin to, solve some of those issues here from a weather climate perspective, and looking at different industries out there, whatever those industries are.
Yeah, yeah, we're in the lumber industry, and I'm sitting here just thinking about obviously supply side. We've got
Mhm.
wildfires make a big difference. Demand side, if there's tornadoes or hurricanes, um, but the supply chain, yeah, that's another huge issue. We experienced it this year. We had some weather, some rain, believe it or not, in the Pacific Northwest, washed out a rail line, and all of a sudden, what everyone used to wonder, is it going to burn down? Now it washed out, and it affected the prices.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's kind of, it is a very important and potentially overlooked way to analyze market conditions or future market conditions.
Right.
Um, all right, so we established who you are and what you can do for someone. So let's talk about what's happening today. I'm going to let you share your screen here.
Sure.
Oh, that's me. Where are you? Stop sharing. I think you have to share again. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Actually, I'll do that right now. We'll bring up this slide here. You should be able to see that now.
Perfect. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. What are we looking at?
Well, this is the time of year when, this is the beginning or it's kind of now into it, the fire season in the Western US. So, first thing we can talk about some of the trends of wildfires, lately in the last couple of decades across the region, and then talk about kind of, the current situation. So, in a nutshell, if we look at, the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a steady increase in the amount of fire activity across the, western portion of the US, and you lumping into that is the areas adjacent in Canada. In fact, that trend has been quite significant from really 1990 to now, as to you tend to have more fires and more acres burned here, with time. It's been one of the strongest trends that we've seen. We've seen that trend in other areas of the world too, but certainly, specifically in the Western US and adjacent areas of Canada, that trend has been extremely, extremely strong. In California, the trend is even the strongest. We've seen the biggest increase in wildfires there, and also the biggest increase in acres burned overall. In the entire Western US, the other thing historically that's changed with time is the length of the season. It
Okay.
used to be, you go back 20 years ago and more, the length of the fire season in general in the West was around 4 months. That's not the case anymore. It's 6 to 8 months. And in different areas, that's increased even more so than that. So the bottom line here is that you've seen an increase in the length of the season, the time frame of risk, and you've seen an increase in overall, the amount of activity and the amount of the impact on, in this case, talking about supply across those areas. So if we look into this season,
Do you have any,
um,
just quick question, do
here, Michael.
you have any reasons why this season is extended? Why since 1990 it's been,
hmm
more wildfires?
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to a warming environment. And so the decadal warming trends that we've seen over the last, 2 or 3, decades have done a couple of things. Number one, you tend to see, winter snow melting earlier. So you tend to start that process earlier because of warmer springs across the West. Rainfall occurs later in the fall than it used to. The summer is the dry season out west, and it used to be that you begin to get your autumn rains sometimes in, early October or late September across parts of the West, including California. Now that typically tends to be transitioned and shifted into late October, November, sometimes not till December. So the length of the season has become longer, and because of extended drought conditions, that's a combination of heat and precipitation trends here over time, then you've had problems here with what we call mortality of trees. There's a whole issue of pine beetles and invasive species. That's a whole nother kind of discussion on that. But it really comes down to a warming environment overall has caused these issues. Early snow melt, later rains in the fall, and all those issues together have caused the trends that we've seen of an increase in fire issues here overall across the West. And again, we're talking about the West, but many other areas, Europe included, has been also in those tendencies overall.
So it's a double whammy. Things get warmer, snow melts earlier, rain comes later, season expands.
Yeah,
It,
exactly. It's
uh,
longer and it's more severe.
Got it, got it. All right, so this is where we're at today, and what are you showing on this slide here?
Yeah, so one of the things we like to do is, monitor conditions. And of course, the drier that areas are, then the more vulnerable you will be going into the heart of the season. So the heart of the fire season is from this point on. It's late July, it's August, it's September. And in California, of course, that lasts most years into October and then sometimes into November. So we have a long ways to go. So the amount of dryness or wetness, across areas is a benchmark as to how much risk there will be going into the new season, for example. So this is the current situation. We call this product a water risk tracker, and it's a model that we developed to look at, water availability, in this case, drought, and we do this for the entire globe. This is the North American projection. So if we can look at long-term water resources and getting into extreme drought, exceptional drought, all the issues are in the Western US. And that's not always the case. But going into this year, then it's California, it's portions of the West. The plains, again, not a big lumber area, is actually the worst area of North America, from Texas up into Nebraska. That's where we have severe drought across those areas, major issues with water resources across this region, and then extending, into California. If we look further north, PNW and most of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, going into BC overall, their situation is kind of normal. That's totally different than what the case was a year ago, actually. So a year ago, the worst conditions in the fire season last year was most critical, and it was that's where they had the biggest issues, is north. The PNW, California had a bad year too, but the PNW, BC, even some areas out of British Columbia overall. So this year, the risk is in a little bit different spot. It's California. It's much of the what we call the intermountain west, southwest, into areas of the plains, but a different situation further up north in those areas. If we look at the current situation of what we call our WRT, water risk tracker, and we compare the situation now to a year ago, this was a year ago. So a year ago, in those areas of the Pacific Northwest, and in looking at some of the areas across the zone, the northern plains, the Dakotas, Montana, portions of, up into southern Canada, had extremely dry conditions across the region. And in places like the plains, you did not. So the location is different this year overall. So if we go back to this year's situation, the overall risk, kind of what we call the base state going into the season overall, it's lower than last year in places like the PNW and Southwest Canada, thinking about British Columbia. But in other areas, California still at high risk, much of the Intermountain areas, again, getting into areas of Colorado, down into New Mexico, high risk across those areas. So you have high risk going into this season upcoming, but then the risk is in a different place. And you tend to have different parameters here where you will tend to have the conditions here that are most severe in different areas. So another year of high risk, likely a year where you'll tend to have high fire risk, likely high acres lost due to fire, but the area, the locations are a little bit different this year compared to last year.
So, okay, I like to see this. The Pacific Northwest and BC are all in normal. I mean, obviously, a little bit there in Alberta. This doesn't mean we're not going to have forest fires. I mean, they still will
No,
have. There's still going to be forest fires, of course.
of course.
Um, but the idea that it's a tinderbox is probably not the case.
It's not that it was the case a year ago. It's not the case right now. You always have fires every year. That's a normal phenomenon coming up. But the question becomes, is that going into the season, is the risk of above normal, acres being impacted, is that risk higher or lower? Well, it's significantly lower than it was a year ago at this time in those northern areas. Going further south, though, the risk is still quite high, again, of an above average year for fires and acres burned from California across into areas, what we call the lee side of the Rockies, or getting into areas of the plains.
Okay, what could change on this? And is it possible for the map to go from looking like this to looking like last year, or are we kind of locked in as for the year? Do you think?
Well, this is a dry season across most of the Western US. So, in general, at this time of year, the overall values, or the data as we call it, actually does tend to increase or get worse. But this is a slow process. So this is a long-term model that looks at precipitation going back 6 months, 12 months, along with stream flow data and other data sources that we tend to use. So at this time of year in the summer, this never really tends to improve. That's very unlikely. You usually tend to get things a little bit drier, but it's a relatively slow process in looking at this and looking at general water resources on a large scale. So this does not change really week to week. Over a period of months, it could change, but at this time of year, midsummer, early fall, it typically does not change dramatically. If it does, it tends to get a little bit more into the drier categories because this is the dry season. When can this really change or be altered? Of course, it's the winter. That is the time frame, the wet season, if you will, November to March. And that is the period where if you get significant changes during the upcoming winter, that's when you can change this parameter significantly. Of course, much of the West has been in very dry conditions for the last 3 to 3.5 years. No sign of that, changing here at this stage of the game, and so this is not going to alter the fundamental, benchmark of this map. Going in, we have quite a bit of dryness issues in the western U.S. That's not going to change here from now going into fall. Some regional areas may change a little bit, but not the base data, if you will.
Got it. And what we touched on earlier, it's a warmer world right now,
Hmm.
and I think this changes us to the next question about demand, and that is the tropical season. Uh, what's going on?
Yeah, so when you think about the tropics, this is also a great time to think about. This is very early in the tropical season, and of
And
course,
when
the
we say
peak.
tropical, we're talking about hurricane activity.
Yeah, hurricane activity in the Atlantic basin, and the peak month of hurricane activity, it's September. So this is very early in the season. But one of the items that is noteworthy is the fact that we think that the coastal areas, not right along the coast, but even inland, the Gulf Coast, the Atlantic side. The question going into a season, kind of almost similar to what the Western US is the risk going in of hurricane activity higher than lower than normal? What is the risk parameters overall? You can't sit here and say that a major hurricane is going to hit Miami or Houston or South Carolina or North Carolina, but you can look at overall risk and assess whether that risk is on the high side or low side coming up. To assess that, I'm going to go forward a little bit. We look at global sea surface temperatures, one of the drivers of weather overall. This is the driver of the dryness in the western US as well, has been over the past couple of years. And the key area is the La Nina event, these cooler than normal waters across areas of the central and eastern portion of the Pacific. This La Nina event, it's affected the western U.S. For people involved in agriculture. It affects Brazil and Argentina, and it also affects the Atlantic Basin hurricane season overall. When you tend to have a La Nina event in place, and it's quite strong here right now, you tend to have more active seasons, higher risk in the Atlantic basin, meaning the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and the tropical Atlantic.
So why does the temperature in the Pacific matter for the temperature or the hurricanes in the Atlantic?
It all comes down to the jet stream. And so when you have a La Nina event across the Pacific Ocean, it impacts the jet, not only in the Pacific, but elsewhere. So during La Nina events, what we call our subtropical jet that forms in the Pacific and eventually makes its way across the Caribbean and the Gulf and the tropical Atlantic, that jet stream tends to be much weaker during La Nina seasons. And we expect La Nina to be in place well into the fall during the heart of hurricane season. And with a weaker jet, that means less disruptions for possible storms. So the opposite of this, in a El Nino event, you tend to have strong jets, a lot of wind, and winds rip storms apart. So in the opposite of this, you tend to have inactive seasons or lower risk across the region. This year is the opposite. La Nina, you tend to have higher risk, higher storm numbers, and a lot of times, higher intensity of storms as well.
So basically, the big blocker isn't there. So these storms they form off the Horn of Africa, right? And then they
During the heart of the season, yes. Early this season, they're homegrown in the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean.
and they come cruising across the Atlantic and aiming at the beachgoers in Palm or in Miami Beach, and there's
Yeah.
nothing to block them.
Exactly. And without disruption, meaning without a lot of wind that's forming in the Pacific and coming across, you get less disruptions. It's called, we call that less wind shear. So shear tends to rip storms apart. With less winds, you tend to have less disruptions, more storms, and more activity during the season, and also different locations of where storms tend to be.
Now, when you say an elevated risk,
Mhm.
we're going to pin you down on this. Like, how many storms could we expect? I mean, I remember recent years we didn't have like any major hurricanes hit. I think like 2 or 3 years ago. Um, oh, there
Yeah.
we go.
This is the history. And so when we don't use named storms as a measure of risk, because you can have 10 named storms if they're weak or strong, the same number of named storms, but that doesn't tell you anything about risk or damage. What we use is ACE, accumulated cyclone energy. So the higher years, many of us know 2005 Katrina and many other storms here, that was the highest ACE value that we've ever seen. And then years with very low risk. For example, in 2013, we had very low risk, hardly any storms in the Atlantic basin. For the past 6 years, we've had above normal ACE, above normal risk overall. Last year was another active season. With yet another La Nina event this year, we expect our ACE values, our risk in the basin, to be in the high category above normal here overall. And if we have time, we can show kind of two maps that kind of show the trends.
Yeah, for sure.
So this is El Nino, so warm waters in the Pacific Ocean. And since 2000, here's all the storms since 2000, all the tracks of the storms overall. Here's the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, east coast of the US. 65 overall named storms developed during these El Nino seasons since 2000. Let's now look at La Nina season. So in El Nino season, it's 65. La Nina seasons like this year, it's 107.
Wow.
And the area where you tend to see much more activity, Gulf of Mexico, especially the Western Gulf, Caribbean, thinking of Central America, thinking of the Caribbean islands, and then somewhat in Florida, as well as some areas of the East Coast, but especially the Western Gulf, thinking Texas a little bit, and areas of Central America. We'll toggle back and forth one time here. So this is what we have. This season is a La Nina. Compare that to El Nino seasons. Whereas in El Nino seasons, there's virtually no storms in the Western Gulf. In a year like this, you tend to have a lot of activity across that area overall. That's the impact
Got
of
it.
wind shear that develops in the Pacific and rolls across the Atlantic basin here. It makes a very big difference.
And I'm just sitting here thinking, well, okay, so what am I going to do with this great information? I probably want to keep a little higher inventory than not of materials on hand because it could be disrupted. I mean, that's kind of where I'm thinking. I know that that's not your job. Your job is to predict the weather, not tell me how
Yeah,
nice.
I'm not a lumber guy, but that makes total sense. And
Right.
certainly a year that you've really got to watch things very closely within the industry. Oh yeah.
And I guess the other thing I'm just thinking about is we hear, oh, there's a storm developing, offshore, and you've got a week or so to kind of prepare for it. This is a year where the likelihood of that storm making it landfall is higher than the non-year.
Hmm. Exactly. Yeah. Bingo. Bingo. Yeah.
All right. Um, well, that's great. Amazing information. Let's just touch real quick on Europe because a lot of material from Europe comes into the States. Um, is the situation in Europe similar with high water or higher temps, drought conditions for them from a fire standpoint?
Yes. And I am in Europe. I live in Barcelona now after moving from Chicago a couple of years back. And Europe is in kind of a similar situation overall. The fire season has started out very early. It's been very active. You lost a lot of acres up to this point, especially in the western areas, Portugal, Spain, southern France, places like that. And the overall patterns going forward looks like that Europe will have an active fire year, more acres burned than normal. And so the heat and the dryness that we see develop, the kind of variables that we look at here that portend to an active or inactive season, we don't see that changing at all. Probably getting worse here over time through the end of this month in July and then on into August. So yeah, kind of a similar situation right now is that elevated risk of wildfires, elevated risk of acres burned, impacting supply. It's been the case already, and that looks to continue as we head into the later stages of the summer.
Anything for New Zealand or South America because they provide a lot of logs.
Yeah, so
China.
for New Zealand specifically, that area, again, we go back to La Nina. So during La Nina events, you tend to have more drought conditions in the US, in Central America, and South America, Argentina and Brazil. On the other side of the Pacific, like New Zealand, you tend to have wet conditions there. They've been wet in New Zealand in general for the last couple of years, and that looks to continue. Same thing in Australia, same things in Southeast Asia. It's almost like the distribution of rainfall, it tends to be enhanced more on the other side of the Pacific, like New Zealand, Australia, Southeast Asia, and taken away from the Americas overall. North America, Central America, and South America.
All right, let's look forward. Let's move to this part. What's going to change La Nina? What has to happen for the jet stream to shift?
Yeah, this is one of the longest running La Nina events that we've seen. We're now going into, or basically 2.5 years of a La Nina event. All indications point to the fact that this La Nina event is firmly in place through the end of this year and on into the early portion of next year. If we continue to have that, we'd be 3+ years of having a La Nina event. That's getting into the realm of almost unprecedented. There's been a few other time frames historically where a La Nina event has lasted that long, but this would be one of the longest running La Nina events that we've had, looking back at 5, 6, 7, 8 decades here, going back into last century overall. So again, this is a long lasting one. We don't see any signs that it changes into early next year. But eventually, when you look back historically, when you get a La Nina event 3 or 4 years, inevitably you tend to, that would be one of the longest running ones. So in the next couple of years, it would be highly likely, statistically, looking back at history, that we would tend to not have that La Nina event as we go, toward, I guess, the middle portion of this decade.
Got it. Um, let's just shift to how often should someone be paying attention to weather on a grand scale like this? Like, is this if someone's going to use a service like yours? Is it checking in month to month? Does that enough? Um, I'm the conversation is spurred in my mind how often I should pay attention to this. Um, what would you recommend if someone really is inspired by this whole conversation? What should they kind of be paying attention to?
It all comes down to exposure and risk. If your risk is very high, and thinking the Gulf Coast or areas of California here are coming up, and if your exposure to environmental conditions, weather conditions, is on the high side, and you can mitigate that risk with really good forecast information, then that almost becomes a week to week, day to day situation. If your risk is not as high as that, then it depends upon your exposure overall. But every month, certainly every month, every quarter, checking in to see some of these large scale parameters. So it really depends upon the
Yeah.
exposure and the risk on the other end. There's certainly not an answer. There's not a general answer out there. It all depends on your exposure.
Makes sense. And if you're, for instance, if you're a Southern Yellow Pine sawmill and you see a hurricane coming that's going to disrupt the supply of logs into your sawmill, you probably want to build up a little inventory of logs if you could at that time.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
So
Exactly.
makes sense. Okay, last question, and I forgot to tell you about this one. The one we ask is, what does Jon Davis see out there that other people don't see? Like, when if you were at a cocktail party and you said something, people would be like, "Huh? What's he talking about?" Um, I know I forgot to tell you I was going to ask this question, but yeah, what's kind of the I don't know in the back of your mind going, I'm going to keep an eye on that situation because that could really change things up, and it doesn't have to be weather related.
Yeah. Well, I think in general, what's happening right now with commodities, whether you're talking about food commodities, whether you're talking about commodities in general. Yeah, I've worked for many decades out there and always been involved in commodities and agriculture, energy, all kinds of different things out there. But what we're in right now, from an inflationary commodity standpoint, is really unique. And then you start to add some of the supply chain issues that our firm is involved in here overall, and if you start to look at the data and some of the numbers, there's no easy getting out of this. This is a situation overall that it looks like it's going to be with us for quite some time. There's been little blips of big problems, agriculture, energy, due to various different regions out there. But it's been a long time since we had this kind of cycle. We'll call it a super commodity cycle overall. And, there's no easy answers to this overall. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting. It's been fascinating watching things evolve over the last, couple of years. And again, this has evolved over years. The Ukraine war spiked things here this past spring. But some of these items that have been going on, looking at scarcity of things, scarcity of food, scarcity of energy in some situations here, scarcity of commodities in general. This has been going on for quite a while. The Ukraine war obviously spiked things here last spring, but has long-term fundamental, items that have kind of come together, and those look to continue. So the bottom line is that, this situation that we're in is in the world here right now. It doesn't look like there's any, easy answers of getting out of this thing anytime soon,
Yeah,
overall here.
I think technology is our friend, and technology allowed us this visibility into our businesses that we were really able to fine tune everything about our business, including our inventory levels of commodity raw materials. And I think everybody got caught with their hand in, caught off guard a little bit.
Mhm.
Where, yeah, I dialed in my business where truck comes in and boom, it goes out the other door as a finished product, and I wasn't maintaining an inventory, the old just in time thing, and it's been exposed. I think
Right,
that we
exactly.
we probably need to spend a little more money and store up. Plan for the worst, hope for the best.
But for much of the world, especially first world, the term scarcity is something we haven't really had to deal with
Never,
much.
never had to deal with.
And then the last year and a half, we've had to deal with this issue, scarcity of things overall. And then that impacts prices. You get inflationary, items here going on. But this whole item of scarcity, which, many individuals haven't had to deal with ever in their working career, that is a big issue here right now. And to kind of put things in a nutshell, it's the amount of scarcity in so many things that have developed and evolved here, over the past, 6 to 12 months. And there's no quick fix in that. That
No,
takes time to solve those issues here overall,
you
especially
can't.
when you have lots of weather problems out there as well. So,
Yeah, you can't just change someone's perception or attitudes. Oh, I'll just pay a little more money. I'll get it.
yeah,
Well,
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
when the store shelf's empty, it's empty.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
doesn't matter
Not
what you pay, right? Um,
exactly right.
Thanks, John. Thank you so much. If people want to get in touch with John, reach out to us. We can direct you to him. The company name was Everstream Analytics.
Yep.
Um, I just, I don't, after meeting John and learning what he did and talking about his business, I have this newfound respect for the depth and this time frame that you can actually look at weather and make a difference with your business.
Yeah.
So I hope we've opened people's eyes up to not just paying attention to the weather on the news at 10 o'clock, but there's opportunities to lower risk or plan. for your business. So,
And
John?
mitigate risk, which is one of the most exciting things.
Yeah, for sure. Excellent. So we're gonna wrap it up. John, hang on. I'm just gonna end the stream here. We'll see everybody next week. Have a safe weather event for